In September 2024, workers removing tree roots from the garden of the palace of the Uniate Bishops in Chelm, Poland, found something nobody expected to find: 2 children's skeletons in shallow burial pits in a location that no historical record associates with any cemetery. No coffins, no grave goods, the bones of 2 medieval children buried directly in the chalk soil. One of those burials was unremarkable. The other was not. The skull had been deliberately separated from the body. It had been placed face down in the burial pit, resting on a stone, and heavy stones had been positioned on the torso. Dr. Stanisław Gołub, the archaeologist with the Lublin Voivodeship Conservator of Monuments who led the excavation, stated publicly, "The burial clearly shows signs of anti-vampire practices which were aimed at stopping the dead from rising again." What I want to do in this investigation is explain what that means, where it comes from, and why a medieval community buried a child this way. In this video, we will discuss first, exactly what was found at Chelm in 2024, the specific burial features and what each one means in the context of medieval Polish folk belief. Second, why a child was buried this way, and what beliefs about children and the undead existed in medieval Poland, and what kind of death would have triggered this response from a community. Third, what this burial is part of, the broader archaeological picture of anti-vampire practices across medieval Poland, documented across multiple sites and multiple time periods, and what it tells us about how communities managed fear in the medieval world. Everything in this video comes from the 2024 archaeological discovery, published statements from the excavating archaeologist, and peer-reviewed research on medieval burial practices in Poland. Chelm is a city in what is now eastern Poland, near the Ukrainian border. The palace of the Uniate Bishops were where the burial was found, and it was part of a larger cathedral complex, the Basilica of the Birth of the Virgin Mary. The palace itself was constructed during the early 18th century, but the ground beneath it is much older. Based on geological analysis of the layers in which the skeletons were found and associated pottery fragments found nearby, archaeologists dated the burials to the early Middle Ages, approximately the 13th century. In medieval Poland, as across much of medieval Eastern Europe, death was managed through a combination of Christian religious practice and older Slavic folk belief. The two traditions coexisted, sometimes in tension, sometimes in synthesis. The folk belief tradition included detailed and specific beliefs about what happened when people died in particular ways and what those deaths might do to the living. This was not a fringe or marginal belief system. It was mainstream, it was widespread, and it was taken seriously enough to be reflected in how communities buried their dead, which is how we know about it at all. Burials are the most durable records the medieval world left us. What people did in their graves tells us what they actually believed, not just what they were supposed to believe. Dr. Gołub's published statement describes the Chelm burial in specific terms. The skull was separated from the torso. The skull was placed face down in the burial cavity, resting on a stone. Heavy stones were positioned on the deceased's torso, and 2 post holes adjacent to the burial suggest the grave was originally marked by wooden poles, allowing the site to be monitored for signs of disturbance. Each of these features is individually documented in the academic literature on medieval anti-revenant burials. Together, they form a pattern that is unmistakable to archaeologists who work in this period. The decapitation served a specific function. It prevented a revenant from finding its head, which was believed necessary for leaving the grave. Placing the skull face down meant that any attempt to move would drive it deeper into the earth rather than up and out of it. The stones on the torso added physical weight to pin the body in place. The grave markers allowed the community to check whether the burial had been disturbed from within. This is not one feature that might be coincidental. It is 4 separate, specific, documented anti-revenant measures applied to a single child's burial. The combination tells us that the community was not uncertain about what it was doing or why. They believed this child posed a specific danger, and they took systematic steps to prevent that danger from being realized. The Atlas Obscura investigation of anti-vampire burials in Poland, drawing on the work of anthropologist Marek Polsyn of Ontario's Lakehead University, explains the belief system in detail. In medieval Polish folk tradition, those who died before their time were believed to be at risk of becoming revenants, malevolent entities that return to attack or curse the living, Categories of death that were understood as untimely and therefore dangerous included death in epidemic disease, suicide, and death before or shortly after baptism. Children who died young, particularly those who died before baptism, were considered vulnerable to possession by demonic entities, which could then use the body to harm the community. The term vampire is, as Polsyn notes in his academic work, a modern one. The entities that medieval Polish communities feared were what the broader Slavic tradition called strzygi, or related spirits, associated with specific kinds of untimely death, capable of causing illness, misfortune, or further deaths among the living. The term anti-vampire is used by archaeologists as a descriptive shorthand for this broader tradition of anti-revenant burial practice. The logic of the burial follows directly from these beliefs. If a person's death was categorized as the kind that made them dangerous, the community's responsibility was to prevent the body from being usable. Decapitation, face-down orientation, heavy stones. These were all documented methods for ensuring the corpse remained permanently inert. The ancient origins analysis of the Chelm burial notes, the explanation for why child vampire burials came about likely comes from the belief that their untimely deaths are due to vampire visitations, and so they would potentially be transformed into the undead themselves. A child who died young for no understandable reason fit the profile of someone taken by a malevolent entity, and someone who might therefore become one. The Chelm burial is not unique. It is part of a documented pattern of anti-revenant burials found across Poland that archaeologists have been excavating and analysing for over 2 decades. In 2013, archaeologists working in Gliwice, southern Poland, excavated several graves in which the heads had been severed and placed on the legs of the deceased, a variant of the decapitation method. In 2008, decapitated skeletons were found in an older section of Kraków. At Drasko in northwestern Poland, 6 skeletons were found buried with sickles laid across their necks, or stones beneath their jaws, documented in a 2017 Smithsonian Magazine article covering the research of anthropologist Leslie Gregorica of the University of South Alabama. In 2022, near the village of Pien, the woman known as the Vampire of Pien was found, a 17th century burial with a sickle across the neck, pinning her to the grave. In 2023, another child burial at the same site was found with a triangular padlock attached to the feet. Archaeologist Dariusz Poliński stated, such practices originated in folk beliefs and are sometimes described as anti-vampire. The accumulation of these findings across multiple sites, multiple time periods, and multiple regions of Poland builds a picture of a belief system that was consistent, widespread, and taken seriously, enough to be reflected in formal burial practice. These were not fringe communities, they were mainstream medieval communities, doing what they understood to be necessary to protect the living from the dead. Polkin, in his academic paper on early modern interments from Drasko, connects the resurgence of these practices in the 17th century to the Counter-Reformation, arguing that as Catholic clergy emphasized the devil and witchcraft, Polish communities reached back to older Slavic folk beliefs about the living dead. The folk tradition and the Christian institution, it turns out, address the same fears in complementary ways. 2 more things to cover, including what we still don't know about the Chelm children and what the burial tells us about the community that made this decision. If you liked the video so far, subscribe. The 2 child skeletons from Chelm were removed from their burial sites, documented, and taken for anthropological analysis according to the September 2024 statement from the Lublin Provincial Conservator of Monuments. Detailed results of that analysis had not been publicly published at the time of this investigation. Anthropological analysis of skeletal remains from this period and region can reveal information about age at death, biological sex, signs of disease or injury visible in the bones, and sometimes cause of death where the cause left skeletal evidence. What it usually cannot reveal is the specific circumstances that led the community to classify this particular child as dangerous, or what the family experienced. We do not know what killed these children. We do not know their names. We do not know whether they died of epidemic disease in suspicious circumstances or simply young. In a period of high childhood mortality, death before the age of 10 was common. It was also, within this belief system, categorized as potentially significant, a death out of order, a life cut short before its proper span, the kind of event that invited supernatural explanation. The location of the burial is significant in itself. The Lublin Provincial Conservator of Monuments stated that the remains had not previously been associated with any known cemetery. This is consistent with anti-revenant burials found elsewhere in Poland. People classified as potentially dangerous were often buried separately from the community cemetery, at the margins of settled space, close enough to reach, outside the community of the ordinary dead. The two wooden posts that flanked the grave, visible as post holes in the archaeological record, indicate that the grave was marked and monitored. Someone in the medieval community was checking, for some period after the burial, whether the grave showed signs of having been disturbed from within. That level of ongoing attention tells us something important. This was not a burial people made and forgot. It was a burial people watched. Here is what the Chelm burial tells us, held at the level of what the archaeology can actually support. A child died in medieval Chelm, probably in the 13th century. The death was classified by the community as the kind that made the child potentially dangerous to the living. The community then applied, systematically and deliberately, a set of documented anti-revenant measures: decapitation, face-down skull orientation, stones on the torso, above-ground markers for monitoring. The community that did this was not a fringe group or a cult. It was a mainstream medieval Christian community living in the shadow of a significant religious site. The fact that this burial was found in what would later become the grounds of a bishop's palace tells us something about the geography of belief in medieval Poland. The folk practices and the Christian institution occupied the same landscape, managed the same fears, and addressed the same anxieties about death and what follows it. Dr. Gołub's statement concludes, burying with the face to the ground, cutting off the head, or pressing the body with a stone are among the methods used to prevent a person believed to be a demonic being from leaving the grave. This is the contemporary professional assessment of what the evidence shows, not speculation, archaeological documentation. The anti-revenant burial tradition in medieval Poland is one of the most direct records we have of how communities processed fear of death and the uncontrollable. Medieval childhood mortality was high. Communities regularly lost children to epidemic, to accident, to causes they could not explain. The belief system that produced these burials was, in some sense, a system for managing the incomprehensible. A child died too young for no understandable reason. The folk tradition provided a framework and a response. Bury it this way. Mark the grave. Check back. Whether that framework was literally true is a category error. It was the framework available. The people who buried this child in Chelm in the 13th century were doing what their belief system told them was necessary to protect the community they lived in. They were not ignorant. They were frightened. And they were doing what frightened communities do. They acted on what they knew. The archaeologists who found the burial in 2024 are doing something different but related. They are trying to understand what that belief system was and what the people who held it were responding to. The child in the chalk soil of Chelm is 8 centuries later evidence. Of what specific event produced the burial, we can only guess. That it happened and how it was done is documented. If you like this video, subscribe and tell me in the comments, what do you want to see next?